Welcome to the Mindful Millennial Podcast, where host Seth Marcus dissects and discusses all things impacting the millennial mind. Mentors, peers, and professionals share intimate conversations on subjects such as entrepreneurship, exercise and health, the blessings and curses of technology, travel, and how to navigate adulthood in this age of information. We're the largest generation in history, and we dictate the future. The Mindful Millennial finds a signal through the noise.
Well, hello there, team. Welcome back to the MindMill Podcast. I'm recording this introduction in my home in Denver, Colorado. If you've spent any time here in the Rockies, you should know the golden rule: always wear layers. Especially this time of year, the days can be in the 70s and the nights as low as the 20s. It's a great time to get sick and feel like you just can't seem to get warm. I'm currently wearing my thermals, my beanie, and my scarf inside my house. However, I may change into shorts and a t-shirt and go for a run before the day is out. You just gotta love Colorado. I'm very excited to introduce today's episode to you. This interview is one of the most informative and fascinating conversations I've had the pleasure to conduct. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm very much out of my depth and comfort zone in this episode. Some of my favorite episodes have sprung out of a blank canvas curiosity on the subject, and today is one of those days. Today's episode is with Gina Gerboth, professional midwife, certified lactation consultant, and childbirth educator. Gina is an absolute wealth of knowledge and has been on the front lines of natural birth advocacy for decades. Her career as a birth worker has brought her all over the world, where she has absorbed a global view of birthing techniques and surrounding cultural norm. In this episode, Gina and I discuss the array of options and common pitfalls that new parents face when first becoming pregnant. We also dive into the life of a birth worker and where birthing professions are heading. I found this interview fascinating, and I am so grateful to Gina for providing her insight and her time. So let's get into it. The MindMill Podcast with Gina Gerboth. Well, Gina Gerboth, welcome to the MindMill Podcast.
Thanks.
How are you doing today?
Great, thanks.
Awesome. I'm really happy to be here. I'm excited for this show because sometimes I do interviews with friends on topics that I feel somewhat knowledgeable on, and today is
Not one of those
days. I am out of my element, and I'm very curious. So
Great.
I'm excited to learn from you.
Although I would say you probably have more than the average amount of knowledge.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
We were connected by a former guest and my cousin, Ann Kaplan,
Right.
whose show was very enlightening. And now I'm ready to dive a little deeper into the world of birth and child education.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, you've witnessed hundreds, if not thousands of births.
Hundreds, yes.
Hundreds? Okay.
About 400 or so.
Wow. Outside of your own children, what has been the most memorable or magical birth experience that you can come to think of?
I think that my friend's birth was the first birth other than my own that I attended. And I was just so emotionally just wrought by the end of the whole thing. My job had been to call all our other friends and let everybody know when the baby was here. And I just couldn't even get 3 words out. I was just completely emotional. And that's definitely the most memorable, the first one that I ever attended.
Were you a midwife at the time?
No, I was just her friend. I wasn't even student midwife. I wasn't a doula. I knew that I was interested in midwifery, although it wasn't quite the right time for me to start. So I had an interest, but I was not in any official capacity other than her friend.
So this was a home birth?
Yep.
And you just were invited?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was a small town, and it was my midwife was her midwife. So it was certainly a comfortable group, and we knew each other really well. And but it wasn't in a professional capacity at all.
Yeah, I got to experience a home birth, I guess 4 years ago with Ann's youngest child, Sky. I wouldn't say that it inspired me to get into birth services, but it was a unbelievably powerful experience.
Yeah.
You can't deny that feeling.
Right.
I bring up this sensation a lot, but there's just something about a moment passes and now there's a new human in this room that wasn't there beforehand. And
Right.
that is the definition of birth, but somehow when it happens, the action of it is so powerful.
Right. It never ceases to amaze me when I look at so the baby first comes out and we place the baby on the mother's abdomen. And every single time I look at that baby on her body, and I think that was just in her body. Mm-hmm. And it's really awe-inspiring to think that that just all happened in a moment.
Yeah. It's also so primal and so deep-seated in our genetics is to have babies and to procreate and this instant connection between mother and child. it was amazing to witness. And
right. Oh, good. I'm glad you got that
maybe
experience.
one day I'll experience it.
I'm glad that you thought it was awesome, but also it was great that you were able to have that opportunity, because I don't think a lot of young men are able to see that.
When a lot of people aren't able to experience it in the same way.
Right.
And I'd already had 4 children and was a doula doing a natural home birth. And there were so many things that she had learned and experienced to get to that point for me to have such a positive experience. I'm sure you've seen so many different stories of more
managed and
managed or compromised situations. What would you say are the biggest differences between home birth and conventional hospital births? And obviously, why choose home birth over those?
So it really does depend on what makes you feel safe as a birthing person. So I wouldn't say that no particular person should or shouldn't choose home birth. It's all based on what you want, what you value, what's most comfortable for you, because you're going to have your baby in the most uninterrupted way possible if you're comfortable. But the biggest advantages to home birth, it's really physiological. It's usually attended by a midwife, and midwives subscribe to something called the midwives model of care, which basically says that childbirth is a normal stage in a woman's life. So it's not treated as a medical event. It's not treated as something to be managed. It's treated as something to be kind of revered. And we're cautiously paying attention for those times when it looks like something is outside of the realm of normal.
Sure.
So that's just a different approach than expecting something bad to go wrong. Kind of being on alert. We're paying attention, but we're not expecting that to happen. So people that are birthing at home have a lot more freedom of movement. They have their own comfort things. They have their own food. They have their own beverages. One of my very favorite home birth quotes is from Dave Matthews, who said, home birth was really great because I knew where the beer was. Not that celebrities should influence our decision-making either, but it was just a great quote, because you really are in your element and have the things around you that comfort you, whether that's your dog or your kids or not having your kids around or whatever you want. So what we do is we are guests in your home, and we're invited in, and we come in respectfully, and we listen to your preferences and your desires. And really, we just follow you around and do our monitoring and our surveillance in whatever way works for you. Occasionally, we have to say, hey, could you stand up or could you lean back to try to get a good reading on the fetal heart tones or something like that. But for the most part, we're accommodating you and not the other way around. Whereas if you're in the hospital, especially, you're in their house following their rules and their protocols, and they are getting better. They're definitely getting better than they used to be. My first son was born in the hospital 21 years ago, and it wasn't a bad experience, but I certainly didn't have the level of autonomy that I see women today have in the hospital. So it is improving for sure.
It seems like maybe that line is starting to get blurred a bit, but when I speak to people about birth, there seems to be a one side or the other. People tend to lean very much towards natural home births, or that's foolish. I need to go to a hospital immediately. Am I accurate in that?
There can be some black and white thinking. Yeah, you're not wrong. I would say that people on both ends of the spectrum that are really only seeing it one way or the other aren't well informed about either side of the spectrum as well. Mm-hmm. So for example, if somebody is really dead set on having a home birth or bust, I want to hire you because I want a home birth and I'm not going to the hospital, that's a red flag, because I don't know how your labor is going to go and I don't know what circumstances are going to present. And so I need somebody who can kind of take the big picture and say, okay, so tell me more about this. What are my options? What are the risks? What are the benefits? And we make a decision together based on preferences with the clinical picture in mind too. So it can't be one way or the other on either end of the spectrum.
Sure.
And definitely there's plenty of research to show that it's not foolish or reckless or dangerous when certain parameters are in place to go forward with a community birth. So we are sort of getting away from the term out of hospital birth, but that is what used to be used to refer to birth center births or home births. And a birth center meaning a freestanding birth center not affiliated with a hospital.
Okay.
But now we're moving to the term community birth, because we really do need to remember, I did like that you said conventional birth choices instead of traditional birth choices, because people will say, But why are people having home birth? Why aren't they doing it in the hospital like traditionally, like people are usually doing? And you have to remind people that it is actually traditional not to have your baby in a hospital.
I know it. The concept of conventional wisdom has been formulated anywhere between the last 10 to 100 years.
Right.
And what we consider normal or the safest practice or the best practice is consistently being questioned right now on a number of different topics, but especially with birthing.
There's a lot of areas in the hospital where protocols don't reflect best practice. For example, withholding food in labor, there's really very little evidence to support that, and yet it is really common in a hospital setting still.
You said holding food in labor?
Withholding food.
Withholding food. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, so they don't want you to
They want you to be like fasted or something?
Yeah, the risk is that if you were to have an emergency C-section under general anesthesia, there's a chance that you could aspirate fluids while you're in surgery. But first of all, the chance of having a C-section is relatively low, not low enough. And the chance of having an emergency C-section under general anesthesia is quite low. So to withhold food from 99% of women for this 1% chance, when the food gives you energy and can help you get through those long labors, it can actually cause harm.
When I think about the whole birthing process from beginning of the pregnancy to the birth to after the birth and beginning your parenting roles, there seems to be such a long checklist. So many things you need to figure out.
Right.
However, it's kind of an analogous to life, but it seems like what you're saying is that above all else is just feeling comfortable and having the stress levels low, and whatever facilitates a calm birthing person is the highest chance of success.
Right. And there's chemical reasons for that. There's biochemistry. When you are stressed, there's adrenaline in your body. And when you have high levels of adrenaline, you don't have things like beta endorphins. Those are what are going to help with the pain. And you mess things up chemically when you have high levels of stress. So I've had couples come into me, and really it was the husband that was pushing for home birth, and the mother was not necessarily on board. And I can guarantee you they don't have home births because they're
not a unified front.
Right. And they can get all the way through to labor, but unless that's really where you feel safest, things won't progress. So it really needs to be about the birthing person's comfort. And by the same token, many people come to me for an interview and want to explore home birth as a possibility. And the mom is more wanting a home birth, and the dad is uncertain and has some doubts. And sometimes we'll kind of put his foot down and say, we're not doing this.
Sure.
And of course, I don't always know how those stories end, but remembering that it's actually the birthing person that has to be the most comfortable is really important.
What would you say is the common first step in, okay, we're pregnant, now what? YouTube, Google, books, contacting doulas, doctors, midwives?
Yeah, so it's interesting. A lot of people have come to me after watching this documentary called The Business of Being Born. Okay. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but Ricky Lake actually produced it.
Okay.
And it's very popular, for lack of a better word. It's on Netflix, or at least it used to be on Netflix. And it kind of talks about these issues in a, documentary. So a lot of people watch that, and it helps them question their assumptions and think about, maybe what I thought to be true about safety isn't actually the whole story. So that's definitely a starting point for a lot of people. They see something.
Do you agree with that being a good starting point?
Yeah. I mean, I do think we have to be cautious about, again, the celebrity factor, because definitely it's something that really does impact home birth, PR, for lack of a better word.
Sure.
But it should be a starting place, not the end story.
Yeah.
For sure. So people will watch something like that. There's another new video out called Why Not Home, and it's about medical professionals who chose to have their babies at home, or at least to plan a home birth. There's some of those kind of videos. Sometimes people have met somebody that had a home birth. You've now seen a home birth, so that's probably going to influence your decision making. So sometimes there's that personal connection. YouTube's just, I don't know, it's interesting. There's a lot of content, and it's really hard to weed through it and know what's realistic and what's not realistic.
True. I would go to say that I do enjoy YouTube when I'm looking to gain information, but it's a matter of you have to rely on that gut reaction to the person that's presenting.
Does this make sense?
If it's very scripted and very robotic, I tend to feel like it may be a bit questionable. But when someone's just flowing as knowledgeable and as comfortable with the subject as you are right now talking about it, it inspires a lot more confidence in the quality of the product.
So I do think people probably do use it for information. So most of the time people actually have a little bit of an idea of what they want before they get pregnant.
I would say women probably do.
That's a good point.
I have no idea. Maybe a bit more now that I have my history with
That's a good
with
point.
doulas and family. But
yeah. So it kind of depends. When I got pregnant the first time, and I had tried to get pregnant, so it's not like it was something that just surprised me and took me off guard.
Sure.
I just did what everybody else does, which is make a doctor appointment. And so it's very, very easy to get swept into the medical model that way.
Right. You kind of take
just
that
do what
path,
people do. Yeah. And that's exactly what I did. Although I do remember reading, there's a very popular childbirth book called What to Expect When You're Expecting, and natural birth people just despise this book. It's terrible, but that's the book that you go to the bookstore. So you go to the bookstore, you get this book. Actually, that's what we did because we didn't have social media and stuff like that. But
that was 21 years ago too.
21 years ago. Well, 22 years ago.
Sure.
By the time I just got pregnant. Anyway, so in that book, they did kind of introduce you to different choices. They did make home birth sound crazy. But they made a birth center sound like a reasonable alternative for somebody who wanted a natural birth. But we didn't have one at the time in Denver. So I do think I would have been influenced enough to at least look into that at the time. But it wasn't a choice. So choices are always great. So you might get your information from something like that and then make your doctor midwife appointment. If you're considering a home birth, there's usually kind of an interview process involved. Usually I encourage people to interview 2 or 3 midwives, pick the one that A, you feel qualified, and B, you feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
Because those are both really important things. But people don't tend to do that with obstetricians. They tend to just make their appointment and get started with care. And I do think that millennials are better consumers of information. And so I'm hoping that that will change a little bit and that people will have at least more awareness of what their provider that they're choosing is, what their philosophy is, and what their particular bent is.
I think that's an accurate statement. Obviously, it's not a blanket statement,
right.
But if I were in that situation, the first thing I would do is scour the internet for reputable information that at least tells you about what is out there, what are the options, as opposed to the more conventional approach, which would be to just go right to the doctor and immediately
and I picked
start
the one
taking
that was
that
closest to my workplace. You know, it was literally
Sure. Well, this was before the internet as well.
Yeah. Well, it was. I think Google was born in.
It was before the internet was used.
Quinn was born in 1997, and I think Google was born right. It was really close to
Sure.
the same time, but yeah, definitely. So you did. You made logistic decisions for things that were really, really important.
I was speaking with Anne before this interview, and she had brought up a really interesting point that I wanted to ask you about. And please correct me if I'm mistaken in any of this. Home births are more often cheaper than hospital births.
Yeah.
However, almost no insurance companies cover home births. So the out-of-pocket expenses for a home birth tend to be more expensive for the birthing person than going to the hospital. Am I accurate in that?
It's complicated.
Okay.
So that used to be true. But now we really have some high deductible plans right now. Like I think what's considered to be a silver level plan is a $3,000 in-network deductible.
Okay.
And then like 80-20. So you would pay 20% plus $3,000. So a hospital birth that costs $30,000, that's going to be way more than a midwife that costs $3,800 or $4,000 or whatever.
Sure.
And there's also, it's a little bit of a simplification in that I usually have pretty decent out-of-network reimbursement as long as they don't have any prohibitions. So some insurance plans have certain exclusions to home birth, but they don't usually. Most plans will at least cover it at the out-of-network rate. So, for example, the last 2 births that I billed for, the families got reimbursed about $2,500 out of $3,800.
Of the total.
Yeah. So that's pretty good.
That's very good.
And that's at the out-of-network. That's without having an in-network exception. But when it is more expensive is when we have a transport. So we start labor at home.
You have to move it to a hospital or to a birthing center?
Well, never a birthing center, always to a hospital
Always
in that
to a
case.
hospital?
Yeah.
Okay.
When we transport in labor, my fee would meet the out-of-network deductible, and their fee, you'd still have to meet your in-network deductible. So that ends up being the most expensive scenario. There's no refund with a transport situation because the way that I kind of explain it is you're not paying for a home birth, you're paying for midwifery care. And a part of that is appropriately assessing those situations where we do need to go to the hospital.
Right.
And it's definitely no less work. It's always more work. I always joke that the people that have their babies in 2 hours are the ones who should ask for a refund or a discount.
Yeah.
Because that's a lot less work.
I may be off on this, but you probably charge for births, not for hours.
Right.
Birth.
Oh, right.
Right.
You
so,
just couldn't.
A 40-hour labor and a 2-hour labor.
Exactly.
Are, sometimes you're going to have to bite the bullet and sometimes you get real lucky. And so does the family having the child too.
And the one with the 2-hour labor would never think to ask for a discount because they're just happy that it all went so smoothly.
Right.
So,
you did a bang up job.
Yeah, exactly. Even though I had nothing to do with it.
No, I wouldn't say that. So I have a small idea, but I would like to know in a bit more detail, what are the key differences between doulas and midwives?
So midwives are clinical care providers and doulas are support people. So midwives also provide support, but we don't necessarily provide continuous hands-on support. Whereas a doula is going to be really there squeezing hips, rubbing back, doing a lot more of the physical labor support, and a midwife is going to be providing emotional support, some physical support, but it usually is more like, hey, Seth, let me show you how to rub her back so that it's helpful, and less of us actually doing all the hip squeezes and stuff because we do need to keep ourselves rested, especially in those long labors for when we're kind of at the big event. And
you got to be sharp
exactly.
when it's important.
Right. Yeah. So conserving our energy is important as well.
Sure.
Midwives perform all of the clinical tasks. So we assess mom, assess baby, and are doing also risk assessment, making sure that we are still normal, low risk, and not in a situation that we need to start thinking about options, whereas a doula is kind of just there to support no matter what happens.
Does the birthing process from the beginning of pregnancy, does it normally start with a midwife or a doula or a combination?
So if someone read the books or saw the videos that made them think that they wanted to do a home birth, they could certainly start with a midwife at the very beginning. It is not uncommon, though, to start with an OB, realize that this is not meeting your personal kind of value system.
That stress
and then
level.
Switching,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So it's not unusual to get people coming to care after some, or sometimes people just have a really strong feeling they have twins or just have something that they kind of want to get checked out with the doctor first, and that they might do that. Of course, we can order ultrasounds and stuff too, so we can also figure that out without having seen a doctor. But sometimes people do have situations that they want to just kind of make sure they're past the risk period, and then they come to care.
In an ideal situation, would you prefer to have a competent doula in the process?
Especially for first-time moms or people that are planning their first vaginal birth. So if they've had a C-section before,
okay,
then having that more focused labor support is really nice. And sometimes they go on to have really fast labors, and it turns out that we were fine. I don't think people ever regret having more support. But if people sort of know, oh, I have quick labors, by the time I realize I'm in active labor, the baby's here not much longer, it might not be something that they would necessarily want to focus on.
I would like to ask you a bit about kind of the other side of being a midwife, which is being eternally on call. And right. On the drop of a hat, you have to walk out the door and be gone for indefinite amount of time.
Correct.
I experienced that a little bit when I was doing some emergency babysitting for Anne when she needed to go out and Mike was maybe out of town or working or something like that. How does that affect the family life? So
kind of to circle back to that first birth I went to when I was interested in midwifery but wasn't pursuing it yet. That birth was certainly not a difficult birth, but she kind of had a puttery labor for a long time, and I ended up sleeping on her couch, and I had a 2.5-year-old at home. And I did realize at that moment that I wasn't ready to be able to accept that on-call lifestyle. So you do have to think about your own family dynamic. And for me, the way that I parented my kids when they were little certainly did not necessarily follow through with that as much as they got older, but I was really, really available to them. I really felt like we did a lot of things like extended breastfeeding and co-sleeping and things that would have been really disruptive if I had not been there for long periods of time. So for me personally, I waited until my family was at a point when I could start to do some of that. Now, there are midwives with babies and they make it work, but I think it would have been really hard for me and my own I don't know if you want to say preferences or family dynamics, but it would have been difficult. But now my kids are 21, 18, and almost 15. And most of parenting involves shepherding my 15-year-old around from activity to activity. And so there's other people that can do it. We actually made a conscious decision to do some intergenerational living, and the grandparents live with us, so that if my husband's not available and I'm at a birth, there's somebody that can, and just to have warm bodies in the house, because they say teenage pregnancy goes up from 3 to 5 p.m. until parents are home. Just having people around is good.
I didn't know that stat.
Yeah, well, it's kind of an old stat. It might not be true anymore.
Okay.
When they're totally left to their own devices, it's not ideal. So we just try to have warm bodies around.
Yeah.
But there's other things too, like if we're going to a movie, sometimes we have to take 2 cars because I don't want to leave them. Once I went to a movie with my youngest son, he was probably 12 at the time. We went to see The Jungle Book, I think, and I got a call 15 minutes into the movie, 20 minutes into the movie, and the dad was like, "You have to come now." So I had to leave him at the movie theater, call my mother-in-law to go pick him up at the end of the movie. Mm-hmm. And then I missed the birth. It was really fast.
Oh, wow.
It was like a 30-minute birth from start to finish. So you really do have to be willing to stop whatever you're doing.
Be ready to go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a go bag?
Oh,
ready?
Everything's in my car all the time.
Always. Okay.
Yeah, always stocked.
Yeah.
I keep waiting for somebody to have their baby in the mall or something so that I can go get my purple bag.
Yeah. That was
I'd be
that was one
ready.
of the questions. I was like, I don't want to ask like that. Like, did you ever delivered a baby in a crazy place?
I
or
haven't,
something?
but I'm waiting for it.
That's the dream.
It is the dream.
That's the highlight reel
Yes.
of being a midwife is I can take care of this. And
Yeah,
you shove the
I've
people to
got
the
it.
side and you
There's a midwife who has a clinic in the Philippines, and she was on a transatlantic flight. No, it's probably Pacific, huh? Anyway, she was on a big flight.
You would fool me.
To the Philippines, and somebody went into labor on the flight, and they said, "Is anybody a doctor? There's somebody in labor." And she actually, even though she's a midwife, she came up, and a cardiologist came up. And so the cardiologist is like, "Nope, this is you. Go for it." He didn't want anything to do with it. So, yeah.
So you just got back in from traveling.
Yeah.
Where did you go this time?
So my friend and I went to England and Paris. I've
Okay.
never been to Europe, so I felt really like, why did I take 45 years to do that trip? It was
Sure.
kind of crazy. So it was great. It was just me and my friend, and we went to England. We actually went to Scotland too. We went to Edinburgh and then
Wonderful.
around to the Lake District in England, and then Bath, and then to Paris.
Okay.
It was
And how
awesome.
long were you out?
2 weeks.
All right.
Which seemed like a long time when we planned it, but it was not very much time in each place.
No. Travel seems to, it has a very strange time warp sense where
it really did.
you may be gone for a week and it flies by and you blink and you're back. But when you think about what was
All
a
the
week
things
before,
you did. Yeah,
before you
right.
left, you're like, that seemed like a year ago almost.
Right.
You know, I had that experience. I actually had my first European experience earlier this year as well.
Oh, cool.
Traveling gives you that unique view on life, and that culture doesn't have to be what you think it is. We
Right.
get locked in. It doesn't matter if you're from France or from America or from Ghana. You are surrounded by like people, and you begin to think that this is the way things are and
Right.
how you should think, how you should interact with others. And that is consistently flipped on its head
When you travel,
when you travel.
And it was really enlightening. So I do chat at people a lot, and especially in England because I speak English.
Yeah.
But I would get to chatting with these docents and gift shop clerks, and they're usually retired people. Like one of them was, we were in Bath at the Royal Crescent, and the first docent he said something about, I always tell my patients, I mean patrons. And I was like, oh, so you used to be a doctor. And so, we chatted about that, and I told him I was a midwife. And it was so interesting because in the United States, if you tell people you're a midwife, it's either they don't know what that is, or they thought it was something that only happened in olden days.
Sure. Okay.
Or they act like you are a crazy person that just eschews all science. And in England, of course, like the vast majority of babies are born with midwives. So
Interesting.
it was just nice to have a normal job.
Right.
For
You're
a
like,
change.
Oh, yes, you're a valuable member of society.
It was kind of nice. It was great not being rogue countercultural
Yeah.
for a little while.
Do you tend to observe the birthing processes in different countries when you travel? Is that something, or do you kind of try to go on vacation from it?
Of course, I don't travel that much, but I didn't on that trip, of course. I kind of wondered. My friend that went with me was not a birth person, so it would have, I don't know, it would have been weird to ask her to. So the reason I took that trip is that I was looking at my passport one day and I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't used this forever. I got my passport in order to go do some clinical experience at a birth center in Bali in 2009. So I realized my passport was about to expire. So in Bali, of course, I did a lot of births, like 50 or so. Yeah. But then no. And then the only other trip between Bali and England and Paris was Cancun, which just doesn't even count as actually international.
I completely agree with that.
It's basically like Vegas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, that's really the only international travel I've done.
I imagine you've probably worked with mothers and families from different countries. Is that an interesting difference for you when you're working with them? Yeah.
I mean, one really great thing about being a midwife, it's really a day in the life in somebody else's, another culture, another family's life that you really wouldn't get the same kind of day in the life. For example, I've only been to one Amish birth, but I have been to one Amish birth, and it was long and puttery, and so we slept there. To be in an Amish house for 24 hours was like really such a privilege. People don't get that opportunity to see how another culture lives. But here in Denver, it's not so much, but there are different groups that tend to favor birthing at home, I would say.
Sure.
But it's not necessarily the same kind of immersion.
I want to know, during the Amish birth, were there technological limitations during that process?
No. They had, I can't remember, like lamps on the wall they must have been kerosene or some kind of gas.
Oil of some sort.
I don't really know. So there was light. There was plumbing. There was a well water. So we didn't have any trouble with water. Of course, we bring our own equipment. You're allowed to use your equipment. So listening to the baby with the Doppler and stuff like that. It's all
that was allowed in the Amish house?
Yeah, okay. You don't necessarily have to change your practices. Okay. We can use our phones. I was actually really surprised. So one thing that's really great that they do is they'll have a teenage girl from, I don't know, maybe it's your sister or your niece or whoever. A teenage girl will come help out the family because they generally have other children that need to be cared for. And she had a cell phone. I was like, that's interesting. But it's because if it can be generator powered, it's okay. So it's not
generator powered.
Yeah, it's just that they're not on the grid, but they have some electricity.
So if they use gasoline and have a generator in the back of the house, they can just.
I don't know.
I need to get an Amish person on the show. I don't know. I was going to say I need to generate my power for the podcast, but I'd be fascinated. I was just recently, a few weeks ago, in Pittsburgh, and I learned that the Amish owned all of that land from the 16th century or whenever they settled in that area. And during the Industrial Revolution, and especially during the late 1800s when the steel industry came about, and Pittsburgh was the hub of that, the Amish made a fortune being the landlords of that land, and they still have a huge grip on the city as far as they own all this land. So I think the amount of income that they make from just being the landlords at the right place at the right time allows them to have a comfortable lifestyle where they continue to have this incredibly simplistic way of life without going into poverty or not being able to feed your family. Right. I don't know any amount of how much that does actually support the community, or if it's a few families, or if it really supports almost the entire
I'm not really
Amish
sure, but
population.
I don't think they have to pay taxes. I think that it's against their religion. I might be wrong. I don't know. Anyway, so I'm sure that it probably stays pretty insulated, but anyway.
It's fascinating to me.
It was really super. It was just such a privilege to be able to do that. Cool. And some midwives attend, especially on the East Coast, Pennsylvania, Ohio. They do a lot of Amish births, and I live in Denver, so I don't get that opportunity very often.
It would seem like Amish would almost by necessity choose home births.
Yeah, well,
they wouldn't want to go to a hospital.
It is interesting. They definitely default to home birth, but they're also not opposed to medical intervention if necessary. But if it's not necessary, then it's not their preferred mode of delivery for sure.
So how was the experience delivering 50 births in Bali?
In Bali. Well, so it was a whirlwind. The first day I got there, I was only there for 5 weeks. Well, it's like almost 6 weeks. So, we're talking like
6 weeks.
10 births a week.
You had 2 a days?
And what's funny is there were 2 students, so we alternated days. So that's 10 births in every other day. But it was great. Bali's gorgeous. Have you been to Bali?
I have. My first international travel was to a yoga teacher training in Bali.
Yeah. I mean, it's just magical. It's literally magical. So that was great. And then we were in Ubud, which is not on the coast, but
As was I.
so the clinic was established by an American midwife who's still there. They still are running the clinic. And there's a lot of poverty, of course. And there's also a lot of practices, like my understanding, and it could be really flawed. I don't want to speak for anybody, except my impression at the time was if somebody went to the hospital and they couldn't pay their bill, they might like hold their baby. It was really, there were just some kind of, almost want to say predatory practices. I don't know, but there was national health care though. So I don't actually know how I don't really understand the system. So the clinic was free. It was kind of a donation-based clinic. There were also a fair number of expats who birthed there. I think it was a more comfortable environment for them. I grew up hearing things like, well, women in other countries just squat in the fields and have their babies, and we have all these troubles and they don't have these troubles. And it definitely called that into question. People are totally the same. It's really hard getting a baby out no matter where you live.
I can imagine.
And so to me, it really like unified my vision of humanity a little bit. Like we're all sharing this really primal, really basic experience.
Yeah.
And it's hard and everybody just needs support. And I barely spoke the language, although I do think Indonesians are really, I picked up a lot in that short amount of time. It's a very simple language, but not enough to like have a conversation with somebody. But really, it's not about what you say to people. It's just about being there for them and being supportive. And so, yeah, so I got lots of Indonesian midwives and I met a couple Australian midwives. It's sort of like their Peace Corps kind of thing. So they would get placements at international sites and they were doing capacity building. They weren't necessarily there to catch babies. And so they were great support. I got to learn from Australian midwives and Canadian midwives and Indonesian midwives and American midwives. It was great.
I can only imagine being in Bali for 50 births.
Yeah.
Everything there is.
It was awesome. You'd be on call for 24 hours and then you'd go get a $4 massage.
Yeah, and a 75-cent coconut. Or
Yes.
Oh, man, I love them.
That was one thing I did that was really funny but embarrassing is that I said, so coconut and head sound really similar. Do you remember how to say coconut? Kabbalah?
Yeah, that was what I was thinking.
One or the other is head and one or the other is coconut. Something like that. I forget now. But once I said...
Cabeza is head in Spanish. So maybe...
But I think it's kind of similar. But anyway, I could see the head and I said I can see the coconut. So it was it's good to be humbled.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. I had quite a shocking experience when I was in Europe earlier this year. I practiced so much Spanish. That's what I had taken classes in when I was a kid. And then when I went to South America a few years ago, I realized how much I really want to have this language in my capacity.
Right.
I wanted to be able to communicate. Now my family lives in Spain, and when I went out to visit them, I was doing Duolingo. I had a teacher, and I got out there and still was having a lot of difficulty communicating just because I went into the lion's den. South of Spain is about as slurred and quick and phrasal as you can get. And I'm used to Latin Spanish. This entire hemisphere speaks a Latin Spanish. So it's different, but there's a lot of similarities between Mexican and Argentinian and Peruvian. But Spain was completely much different. So finally I start to feel like I have my training wheels. I'm getting somewhere. And then I leave and go to Morocco. And then that's where they speak Arabic and French. And I'm just, again, fish out of water.
But you have to just try. I mean, I definitely made an effort. I took 3 years of French in high school. Super useful. Yeah. But I made an effort in Paris. And all you have to do, I mean, really, they mostly speak English. So all you have to do is try. And then you can get around pretty well.
Yeah. I remember... Je ne parle pas français.
Right.
Probably terrible pronunciation, but at least...
Enough to say I don't speak French.
It let them know, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Exactly. Well, I wanted to ask you about where do you think the future of childbirth is heading?
Oh, that's a good question. I should have thought about that. So the pendulum swings, and I think that we are coming off of a highly medicalized period. So I think that we will see more physiological birthing practices kind of start to come into play, even in a hospital-based setting. So when childbirth, well, I think we'd have to go back to kind of Victorian times. That's sort of when the end of home birth as the norm kind of started to come about. There were more hospitals. Male physicians really started dominating the scene, for lack of a better word.
Sure.
Midwives were vilified and, those dirty midwives, they're untrained, et cetera, et cetera. In the meantime, women are dying in great proportions in the hospitals because they still don't have germ theory under their belts yet. And so they're spreading a lot of disease between patient to patient. And I might be off on my timeline, but somewhere around the turn of the century. Then we're kind of 50-50. Some birth is still at home, but it is definitely starting to become more systemic. And then, of course, by the time we get to post-World War II, we're like full-fledged. Let's try to control this. Let's try to take the pain out of it. So they started doing things like, have you heard of twilight sleep?
No.
It's scopolamine and morphine, I think. So they would...
Sounds safe.
Right. They would drug these women to where they were just out of control. They weren't really present in their bodies. They would strap them down, forceps deliveries, and they would be out of their mind with hysteria, which is such a sexist word, by the way.
Really?
Well, because hysteria means like crazy woman frenzy.
I had no idea.
But they were literally hysterical.
Wow. Okay.
And then the scopolamine makes them forget. So they had these like black periods of not even knowing what happened to them.
Like a muddy, no remembrance of the most powerful experience of their life.
And then, of course, we can't really talk about childbirth without talking about breastfeeding. Then these post-World War II doctors are like, formula's better, controllable's better, measurable's better. So they introduced all these artificial feeding methods that were completely substandard now that we know.
A lot of it was economically driven as well.
Yeah, probably. Like, let's sell the... Right. So, we just completely took the power out of a woman's innate ability to birth and feed her child. Completely, like, devastated it. And so then we're, like, super medicalized here at this point.
Yeah.
Then we kind of get into, like, more... kind of the husband coach childbirth, the Bradley method.
When did this come about?
I would say early 80s, probably.
Okay.
70s to early 80s, maybe. A little more like, hey, guess what? You don't actually have to be knocked out and strapped down to have your baby. And so we kind of started the natural childbirth movement around that time. Maybe more like 70s.
It may have tied in a lot with the feminism movement.
Right. I totally recognize these as feminist actions, but I know that a lot of people would disagree with that. So then we're kind of like, at least we're starting this idea that there's an alternative way to have your baby. When I had my son in 97, the C-section rate was at an all-time low. So it definitely had an impact. Well, and let me say this, even when we were super medicalized over in the post-World War II stuff, it wasn't necessarily that C-section rates were going up. It was just really controlled. And so definitely things kind of improved. But then we have kind of swung back to the surgical birth. So right now in this country, we're talking about an average C-section rate of about almost 33%.
Wow.
And so to think about the fact that if you go into a hospital, you have a third of a chance of having a C-section, that's like kind of mind-blowing. It's really regional. It's really hospital by hospital. I think Colorado is probably closer to 25%. We're definitely not on the worst end of the spectrum. But there's places in the South where hospitals have 50% C-section rates. So then we kind of moved back over here to this interventive model. And now we're learning that all of these surgeries come with risks and costs. So we have a horrible maternal mortality rate in the United States, the highest of the developed world.
Really?
Yeah. And we spend 3 times as much money on maternity care.
That doesn't surprise me.
Right. So we spend
the mortality rate does.
So much money, and we're seeing poor outcomes because all interventions have a time and a place, but all interventions also have risks. And so when you're introducing interventions outside of the time and the place that they're appropriate, you're introducing risk that didn't need to be introduced. So what we have are like induction, for example, interventions that are meant to control the process and to make it faster, make it smoother, make it timely. Efficient, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So some of these interventions, we call this the cascading effect of interventions. So you have an induction, and it hurts really bad because, by the way, having an induction hurts worse than natural labor. And then you get an epidural, and then you're on your back, and then you have a posterior baby, and then you end up with a C-section. So kind of this cascade of one thing leads to the other. So I think that now, it probably would not take you very long on a Google search to see that maternal mortality rates in the U.S. are really in question right now. So now I think there's going to be a response to that. And we've already seen it with what's called iatrogenic preterm birth. So babies that are born early because of something that happened to them in that the medical system did. So for example, inducing a baby that turns out wasn't actually full term creates a preterm birth that's then extremely expensive and tons of risks for the baby.
Yeah.
And so the March of Dimes started a campaign called Worth the Wait to try to reduce preterm birth. So I think that what we're going to see is a response to the fact that we're not doing very well, and we'll start moving towards more physiological options. So home birth represents a really tiny piece of the market share, like 2% in most places or less.
Yeah. My vision of this is very skewed because of the community that I'm a part of.
It's a culture. So if you're in that culture at all, it seems like it happens all the time. But I do think that the hospitals will take notice to, oh, this is actually what some people are valuing, and they're responding by providing more options, more alternative pain relief methods, water and labor, those kind of things.
So you think I think it's going to get better. We'll start seeing some of that in hospitals.
I think so.
More
because
natural birth options.
There's definitely there's always an option for natural birth, but more support for it, I would say.
Sure.
I think so. It's kind of what I foresee. Not everybody shares this opinion, but I kind of see it happening.
Okay. Well, I hope you're right.
Yeah, I do too.
It's optimistic.
I do too. I also think that more out of hospital or community birth options they are growing in popularity for sure.
So what advice would you give a young adult that's looking to enter the birthing industry, if that's the term for it?
As a profession?
Yeah. Oh, come on. Gina, you were just so optimistic.
Oh, dear. It's hard. You definitely are going to swim upstream for the rest of your life, and you have to decide if that's really something you want to do. But this change won't happen unless young, new, optimistic people are fired up about it. So it's really important, but it's a life's journey. Mm-hmm. It's not a job that you're going to leave when you come home for the day. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of different pathways to get into birth work and to kind of figure out which one makes more sense. Are you interested in being a midwife? Are you interested in being a doula, childbirth educator? As a midwife, you really have to go through all of those pieces anyway. You have to, starting with being a doula is a great idea, because then you can get the idea of whether or not the on-call thing is going to work, because that's sort of like 101. Can I live with this schedule first? Yeah. But then finding a school that works for you and your schedule and your family. And it is interesting. I teach at Midwives College of Utah, and it's a distance program, obviously, since I'm not in Utah. And we are seeing more young people who haven't started their own families start with their education. Whereas definitely when I became a midwife, almost nobody did it until they had their own kids. Some people, but definitely a minority. Whereas this semester, even our new students are younger, which has an advantage of not having to work that on-call thing around your own family for a while until you start your family.
Well, I think just like in so many different industries right now, there's a big shift in thinking going on. Again, I think my view is skewed because of the community that we live in Denver. It's just a bit progressive and a bit more conscientious. However, we live in this age of the internet, and the baby boomers are coming into the golden years.
Yeah.
The old ways of thinking from the World War II and pre-60s essentially are literally dying off. Mm-hmm. And so that with such a connected community through the internet, I think that these options for natural birth, or just knowing the realistic options for having your birth and following the safest and most in-line birth plan that works for the mother or the birthing person, is growing. Mm-hmm. So I think the demand will fill the supply. True. And so that's my view on it. I agree with that.
I agree. Mm-hmm. And maybe the charge for birth workers is to make it more sustainable, to make this lifestyle a little bit more easy, whether that's in partnerships or practices or what. But maybe there will be that renewed enthusiasm of a different way of looking at it. And maybe we don't have to do it all to where you drive yourself crazy. Being up all night, and then you have appointments the next day, and so you just decide to push through because you don't want to reschedule everybody, and that's not sustainable forever.
Right. And I'm sure you're recommending to your patients to that sleep is incredibly important, yet
Right.
you're sacrificing it on your side.
Right.
Yeah.
And the more I practice and the busier I am, the more I do make room for that, because it actually doesn't do anybody good if you're completely
I totally
depleted.
agree.
Yeah.
I think about it all the time. One of my favorite quotes is, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree and I'll spend the first 5 sharpening the axe.
Right.
Abraham Lincoln.
Is it?
I believe.
Oh,
I also
that's
know
awesome.
that something like 90% of stats and quotes are made up on the spot. So, another one of my favorites.
And Mark Twain, who says, statistics, and damn lies.
So, yeah, that
Something like
guy, I believe all of his quotes because
Right.
he was just so profound
Right.
in everything that he said. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time together. However, I wanted to share with you that I was waiting for a chance to say it, but I figured the end is as good as any time. When I was on my way here, I was speaking with my mom, who's a physician, and in the late 80s, when she was pregnant, she was 6 months in, her birth plan was very conventional. I mean, as a doctor, she's like, I'm going to the hospital, that's happening.
Right.
About, I guess, 3 months before I was born, she went to one of her best friend's births, and they had decided to do a home birth. She witnessed it and saw what a home birth can provide, and it didn't hurt that their baby came out in
Everything was
45
perfect.
minutes, and it was just this little like, ooh, like a couple groans and then
Right.
a beautiful baby boy. It completely changed her.
Wow.
And the interaction with the midwife was so healthy and calming that she changed in her 3rd trimester to a home birth. And I am a home birth from,
Oh.
so I applaud your work and I really appreciate
Well, I
what you
applaud
do.
her for challenging her worldview about it. That was awesome.
Yeah, she's a special lady. Maybe one time I'll get my mom on the
You
show.
should do that. That would be great.
She's definitely my biggest fan.
So do you tell people you were born at home?
Yeah.
I
Are there
asked
people?
my-
Are there people who
Well,
are
I
ashamed
asked
of it?
my kids. So my first was born at the hospital. My second 2 were born at home. And my 18-year-old said, oh, yeah, it's something interesting about me. Like he uses it as a conversational piece, I think. And my 14-year-old's like, no, why would I do that? So
All right.
I don't know. It's curious to see how people feel about being born at home themselves.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, I'll bring it up next time
Yeah.
I meet a stranger. I'll be like, "Hey, my name's Seth. I'm a home birth."
It's all
See
about
how far that gets me,
normalization.
right?
It just normalizes it, right?
I should have started this podcast with that.
Hi, my name is Seth, and I was born at home.
Well, Gina, thanks so much for your time and
Yeah.
sharing your story. How can people get in touch with you? And is there anything you'd like to promote while you have some airtime?
It's easy enough. Just my email address is Gina, Gina, at midwifegina.com, and my website is midwifegina.com. So you can always get a hold of me that way. And yeah, no, I don't have anything else to share other than just do your research and find the best choice for you.
Awesome. And I'll provide all the ways to connect with Gina in the show notes. Thank you so much, Gina, and thanks for
Thank
listening
you,
to
Seth.
the MindMill.
That's awesome.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening to the Mindful Millennial Podcast. If you loved this episode, check out some of the other MindMill episodes. They're all free and available at themindmill.com and on all the major podcast platforms. Also, please take a second and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It's incredibly easy and it really is the best way to help the show. Stay tuned for more MindMill episodes coming down the line. I'll keep them interesting for you, I promise. Take it easy. Today's episode is sponsored by Best Self, makers of the Self Journal and other phenomenal productivity and mindfulness tools. At the start of 2017, I had New Year's goals like so many of us. However, having just turned 30, I wanted something different. I wanted to actually achieve my goals, not kick ass in January, followed by the quick decline back to where I started, which inherently feels worse than when I started. I decided writing my goals and recording my progress is the best way to stay the course. I had always wanted to journal regularly, but like many of us, the phobia of the blank page was enough to keep me kicking the can down the road. The self-journal was different, however. Unlike a traditional journal, the self-journal is a 13-week goal-oriented planner journal. It's designed to teach the user to set a tangible goal, break it down into achievable tasks, and work every day towards completion. The journal also includes areas for gratitude and reflection, plus notes and scheduling. So I took a chance. I got my journal and committed to the 13-week program. The outcome was greater than I could ever have imagined. The ironic thing was, I didn't achieve my first goals. However, what I did achieve was the ability to actually see my progress, what I was avoiding, and what to do next. I could actually give myself a grade on my work, not this pass-fail bullshit mentality we seem to judge our lives by. My productivity skyrocketed, along with my routines and overall happiness. I found myself able to focus on the moment, the present, rather than reliving the past or anxiously anticipating the future. If I thought of something, I now had a place to unload it from my mind. Fast forward a year, and I'm now on my 4th journal. What started as a scary new addition to my busy day has become one of my most useful tools. I can look back on this pivotal year of my life, see how far I've come, know where I'm at, and what lies ahead. So check it out. Join the thousands of people who have had their lives radically improved with the assistance of Best Self. Check out bestself.co for all the journal options and other amazing productivity tools. Or follow the link in the episode's show notes to support the Mindful Millennial Podcast. It's all available there.